Hey out there, today is Monday, July 6th, 2020. My name is Matt Fury, and you are listening to The Rough Cut. All right, here we go once again. Lots to talk about today. Let's start with our featured attraction for this week's podcast. Editor Paul Hirsch talking about The Empire Strikes Back. Now, for some of you who aren't immediately bought in at the mere mention of a Star Wars movie, you might be asking, didn't that movie come out a while ago? Well, yeah, it did. But it was how long ago that's important. This year marks the 40th anniversary of Empire, a film that not only is widely regarded as the best of the 9 Skywalker saga films, but also has some other distinctions that should be noted. If you think about it, it was the first of the sequels, the first to have the challenge of following in the footsteps of the original mega hit. It was also the first film in the saga to have an inconclusive ending, with the understanding that there absolutely would be another film to follow. You gotta remember, there were a lot of doubts about how well the original Star Wars would do. Another thing to consider is that while Paul also worked on Star Wars, he shared the editing duties with acclaimed editors Richard Chew and Marcia Lucas, and the three of them were undoing the work of an original uncredited editor. For Empire, Paul was on his own and there for the entirety of the film. Now, aside from the film itself and its place in cinematic history, I never want to pass up an opportunity to talk to Paul. We met him last year for a podcast about his career in general when he released his autobiography A Long Time Ago in a Cutting Room Far, Far Away, and that book is awesome. If you don't have it, go check it out. And when you take into account the films he's worked on besides the Star Wars movies like Carrie, Footloose, Falling Down, Steel Magnolias, Ferris Bueller, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Mission Impossible, it goes on and on. This is an editor who has an infinite amount of experience to share, and you should just never pass something like that up. And so I didn't pass it up, and here we are with a great podcast to share. Something else I have to share with you is our new sponsor, Extreme Music. A sponsor. I feel so grown up for once. Who is Extreme Music? Well, in their own words, they offer superior production music crafted by multi-award-winning artists, musicians, and composers. Wow. Another way of saying it is that they create and license music for use in television, film, advertising, and online media. So let's get back to that talent roster. Who they got, you ask? How about Quincy Jones, Hans Zimmer, Snoop Dogg, Atticus Ross, John Powell. John Powell. I know that guy. He's a film composer. Owes me money. I'll get to him later. Extreme Music is not a new startup-y kind of thing, just in case you were wondering. They have been trusted by creators in the media industry since 1997. As for the tracks you're looking for, you can try them before you buy them. You just have to make sure to license them before you actually use them. It's always a good idea. They have tracks from every style and soundscape you can possibly imagine, all categorized for you by talent, collections, trending playlists, labels, you name it. It's all easily searchable by metadata and even lyrics. I'm telling you, if you can figure out how to listen to this podcast, you can figure out extrememusic.com. The website is that simple, and you can basically do everything you would ever need online. But if you do need that personal touch, they have offices all over the world. So, all my listeners in Latvia, all 4 of you, don't worry, Extreme has you covered. So show your support for The Rough Cut by checking out extrememusic.com and up your production audio game for your next project. Imagine that, you could have Hans Zimmer in your next movie. Get out of here. Thank you, Extreme Music, for your sponsorship. It is an honor to have you aboard. So, big news with Extreme Music. Big news having The Empire Strikes Back as our matter at hand. And who better than to share this enjoyable moment with than my man in Hollywood? You can find him online as L.A. Michael K., but we know him here as Burbank Mike, Avid's own Michael Krulik.
Hey, Matt, what's going on?
Not much. How are things in L.A., my friend?
They're all right. It's a nice day. Everyone's, still battling if they, want to go back to work, when they can go back to work. It's quite a roller coaster ride, but I think everybody's running through that right now.
Does it feel like things are sort of picking up, that maybe by the end of the summer we'll be sort of seeing production happening again?
I mean, I think you'll see production. I think there still are, some situations with, deals and contracts that editors and production need to sign, in light of going back. Do they want to go back to? Oh, sorry about that. Little background noise. But yeah, I mean, I think it's still up in the air, but I think people are hopeful, but people are finding that they are being effective working at home, and they actually have a good work-life balance as well.
Speaking of working, Michael, Do you know what this particular podcast is? The occasion of this one, I should say.
Should I say happy anniversary?
Oh, pop a bottle of Sauv Blanc for me, will you?
You got it.
Yes, it's been a year, and what a year it's been. So I knew that I wanted to have you on here, to thank you for your help with a lot of things and your encouragement. It has been a long year, and when I kicked this thing off, I made a goal of doing it every week, which in hindsight might have been a little ambitious, but it happened, and it's been a grind, but it's been fun. So thank you for all your help.
So you're very welcome. It's great stuff too. I mean, it's amazing to get insight. A lot of people don't know what happens behind the scene, and it's always something that may make you change your mind or how you felt about a show or a film when you hear about the process or decisions that were made in the edit bay. So your podcast really pulls that out of the editors.
Thanks, man. Well, that was, the thing about going into this podcasting thing, and some people have asked me about, they want to start one and some ideas behind doing it. The thing they always tell you is you're supposed to really kind of have a specific point to it. And, mine was always just getting people to know the men and women in the editing room and just understanding how much an editor does beyond just editing. And hopefully that comes through. I've gotten some comments about people would like the thing to be a little more technical in nature. I always try and lean in more towards the career aspect of it because I know a lot of people, younger people are listening and thinking about how they're going to get going on their career. So I tend to lean into that. But I'm going to try and be, keep myself honest about making sure the technical stuff comes through as well, because some people do want to know what codec they used or what camera something was shot on or what version. So I'll try and mix that in here and there.
Well, also it's nice that you actually hit, visual effects editors as well. So there's so much to the process and the collaboration that you never know what actually was done to make the film or the television show or documentary. So, again, it's great to hear all of that and also hear the editors banter back and forth and about, the process and working together.
Well, if you like behind the scenes stories, then Michael, today's podcast is for you. We are talking about, drumroll, The Empire Strikes Back.
Get out!
Yes. 40 years ago this year, editor Paul Hirsch cut together an amazing movie called The Empire Strikes Back. Admit it, you saw this in the theater when it first came out.
I think I was one of the many people who waited in line multiple times. The Uptown Theater in Washington, D.C., which unfortunately closed. But that was the place to see films in Washington, D.C.
I admit that I, as a youngster, did see this in the theater when it first came out. So that's how old I am as well. And I was horrified, to be honest. When I saw it, I was shell-shocked. I was like, wait a minute. I wasn't ready for the whole notion of my hero getting his arm cut off and the other hero getting turned into a plaque. And
wait, what happened? Spoiler.
Well, you know what? Let's leave this to Paul. So sit back, relax, and get ready to listen to Paul Hirsch talk about The Empire Strikes Back. Yeah.
According to Skype, last time we spoke for an hour and 47 minutes.
I wouldn't do that to you today. But the first thing I want to know, Paul, I know you're not a big fan of going back and watching your films after the fact.
Right.
And I was surprised to hear that you hadn't seen Empire Strikes Back since, well, not in a while anyway, and that you watched it for the first time the other night just to sort of get prepped for this.
Yeah.
What were your reactions upon seeing the film for the first time in a long, long time?
Well, I tried to remember what it was like for audiences then because it had been 3 years since they had seen a Star Wars movie. And there was such a furor about the first film that the thirst for this picture was just tremendous. And, seeing the characters and saying new lines and new scenes and new situations and everything was very exciting. That said, just, from the perspective of today, I thought the first third of the picture was not terrific.
Really?
Yeah, I thought it worked okay, but I didn't think it was anything really. It plays a bit like a romantic comedy between Han and Leia, which is fine. And the battle is the battle, but it really started to work for me when we got to the asteroid sequence and Yoda. In fact, the scene with Yoda where Yoda lifts the ship out of the bog, I thought I was really sort of blown away by it. I thought, this is such a great scene. And I was watching it and I was thinking, how many elements are contributing to this moment, which is so powerful. And, part of it is the writing. In fact, I looked up to review the writing because it was so wonderful. Luke says, I can't, it's too big. Yoda says, size has no meaning, it matters not. Look at me, judge me by my size, do you? And well, you shouldn't. In the movie, he says, you should not. For my ally is the Force, and a powerful ally it is. All of life feeds it and makes it grow. Its energy surrounds us and binds us. Luminous beings are we. Yoda pinches Luke's skin. Not this crude matter. A sweeping gesture. Feel it, you must. Feel the flow. Feel the force around you. Here, between you and I and that tree and that rock. Yoda indicates the vicinity of R2, whose head spins around looking for the force. Yes, everywhere, waiting to be felt and used. Yes, even between this land and that ship. And the water begins to bubble and so forth. So I was watching this sequence and I'm thinking, this is really kind of magical. And it starts with the writing, but then you add in the character of Yoda, and it's Frank Oz's voice, and it's also the puppeteers that are manipulating the various aspects of Yoda's face, because there were different people controlling the ears and the eyes and the various parts of the face that moved. They had different puppeteers working on different parts of the face, and they had to coordinate all this, and they had to plan the expressions and when his ears pick up and when his ears sag, and there's sort of a reflection of his internal state. And I thought, all this is worked out. And then there was John Williams' music and Ben Burtt's sound effects and the production design and all these elements. And it seems so simple. There's just a single character on screen talking, but there's this army of filmmakers behind this moment that are creating this feeling in the audience. I just kind of blown away by it. I just thought it was terrific.
Did it bring back any memories for you about cutting that scene? Do you remember working on that and just knowing that there was something really special about that scene?
Well, everything in the movie felt special. I mean, but I don't know that it ever really stuck out. Although we used to, one time, George was in the cutting room with me and he was feeling kind of lighthearted. And he had been talking about building the ranch, and I forget the exact context of it, but he made a joke. He said, judge me by my size, do you? And well, you should not, for my ally is money.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know George Lucas, but I could hear him saying that.
He was funny. He could be funny. He could be a funny guy.
Oftentimes a director becomes a celebrity in their own right. And certainly that's happened with George Lucas.
Yeah.
So people they think they know this person. What do you think would surprise people the most about George Lucas that they wouldn't pick up just from being a fan?
I don't know. I mean, George was always a wonderful paradox because on the surface, he seemed just like an ordinary guy. If you went on the set, he'd be standing around, there'd be, a bunch of guys in jeans, their shirt tails hanging out, and he was just another guy. And when you spoke to him, he was very unpretentious and kind of soft-spoken. But at the same time, he had this fantastic imagination, and he had a tremendous business sense that you don't often see combined in the same person. And he had an enormous will and stubbornness in seeing his ideas come to fruition. So in ways that are not visible, he's an extraordinary person, maybe the most extraordinary person I've ever known, but you don't see it from meeting the guy. His qualities are reflected in what he's accomplished and what he's created. He's really an extraordinary person and very kind.
Well, for us to do a proper exploration of Empire Strikes Back, we really need to go back before it. While you were working on Star Wars, did you have any sense that it was going to be the success that it was and that there might be a sequel in the offing?
Well, there were intimations that there would be a sequel in the final change that George made to the first film. He came back one day, very late in the day, and he said, I want to add a couple of shots. I said, what's that? He says, I want to show Vader getting away. So I said, well, doesn't that smack of, sort of commercialism? And he said, yeah, I don't care.
There's that business sense.
He was right. So anyway, we added a couple of shots and we sort of stole some elements from shots we'd already done and created new shots. And we showed Vader getting control of his ship, and then a shot of him going off into space. So that was the first animation that he had in mind, and he had always talked to me about the 3 trilogies. That was, his idea right from the get-go. So, yeah, I knew there was going to be a sequel. And then when I came out to Los Angeles, I was still living in New York at the time. When I came out to Los Angeles for the Academy Awards in 1978, Gary Kurtz and I had lunch together at a Mexican place called El Coyote. And he said, how'd you like to work on the sequel? I said, I'm in. So that was it. And it didn't start for another year.
So that film, The Empire Strikes Back, you had cut Star Wars alongside Richard Chew and Marcia Lucas.
Yes.
And for Empire, you'd be taking the reins yourself.
Yes.
How different was that experience, having to cut such a big film on your own?
It was simpler. You have to remember, I came on to Star Wars after it had already been cut. So we all were having to correct a lot of the cutting that had already been done. And on most pictures on film, it's kind of cumbersome because you have to find the extensions of the pieces that are in there sometimes. And it's all cataloged, and the cataloging had been done according to a UK system that they employ over there, which is really sort of, I can only equate it to their system of money. It was like, pounds, shillings, and pence. It was so complicated. There's a much simpler way to do it. So then on Empire, I instituted the simpler way of doing it. So that was good. And then having to work with Marcia and Richard, we had agreed that since all our names were going to be on the film, that we would consult each other on the cutting that we did independent of each other and get notes from the other two so that nobody felt like they're putting their name on something they didn't really back, So there's a lot of protocol and consultation, and it was appropriate, but it was just a little bit cumbersome. Whereas when I'm working alone, I can just do what I want, and then it gets reviewed by the director and the producers, and So I find it simpler to work alone.
Aside from the editorial change, going from Marcia, Richard, and yourself, George Lucas did not direct Empire Strikes Back, and he did not write the screenplay, just did story by.
Right.
How did that affect you in any way, shape, or form? Working with a new director in Irvin Kershner and George not being the screenwriter, did that manifest itself in any kind of difference with your job as the editor?
Not really. I mean, it was just adjusting to a new personality, making a relationship with the new director. Kirsch was a very accomplished professional. He was a character, and he respected my work. I think he was a little bit nervous because I had cut the first one and he hadn't been part of the team, but we got along fine. I mean, in many ways, he was like a grown-up kid. He had great enthusiasm for things. I remember when we saw Alien in London, and the next day we were talking about it, he said, the entrances to those caves where the eggs were, they were shaped like vaginas. Did you see that? They were like big vaginas. And he was so excited about this, And he was also interested in the mystical aspects of Eastern philosophy and so forth. And I think that made its way into the script. I was not privy to any of that, but I just assumed that he may have had some influence there.
So while you were working on Empire, you just brought up Alien.
Yeah.
Alien as well as The Shining were both in production at the same place you were working on Empire. Is that correct?
Yeah, right.
Sometimes there's, people run into each other on the lot, or there's some crosstalk, or someone will drop in on someone else's editing room to look at things. Was there any kind of interaction with Stanley Kubrick or anybody from Alien?
Yeah, well, I used to see Ridley in the dining room, but we never spoke, and we were never introduced, so, but I saw him there. And then when I was invited to the premiere, on the way out, we had parked our car in an underground parking garage, and we left the theater and we went and we got into a lift to take us down to the parking. And we jammed ourselves in with a car full of people. And then at the last second, 2 more people came and jammed themselves in behind us. And I found myself shoulder to shoulder, inches away from Ridley. And I looked at him and I smiled and I said, good picture. And he looked at me, he said, no, great picture.
Well, that's what you want in a director.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Well, he was right. It was a great picture.
It was.
And the other thing that struck me, at that time, Kirsch was shooting the carbon freezing chamber. And he storms into my editing room and he starts ranting and he's raging about the set. I can't believe have you seen that set? And I said, I couldn't remember if I had been there yet or not, you know. And he said, this set it's got this incredible ceiling and it's got this incredible floor, but there are no walls. There's no walls. It's a set without walls. How am I going to shoot the scene? I got to shoot down at the actors. I got to shoot up their noses. There's no set. There's no walls. And then he would storm out again, you know, and I would think, thank you for sharing your anger with me. But then we saw Alien, and, you know, and what I noticed, because I had been sensitized to it, was that in the alien ship, there's all this stuff on the walls. Sigourney is walking around the ship looking for the alien, and it's great stuff, you know, because the thing is going to leap out at you any second, and it's really wonderful. But I started to notice how much money the art department had put on the walls, and I thought, yes, this makes sense. So now when I see the carbon freezing chamber, I really have to, you know, I mean, it's really true that the thing that comes down is fantastic, and the pit is, you know, all that's wonderful. But you look, and all there is in the background is steam and blue light.
Yeah,
that's it.
Just in limbo.
There's no set. There's no set. So,
well, Kirsch is right.
Kirsch was right, and then he was right about a number of things. I also bumped into Ray Lovejoy, who was Stanley's editor and had been since 2001. And we got to chatting, and I said, Ray, I understand you're using a video editing setup on The Shining. I wonder if I could come see how it works. He said, oh, yeah, I'd love to have you. He says, give me a call at the end of the week, you know. So I called him, and he said, oh, today's not so good, you know, maybe next week. I said, okay, you know. So I called him the following week. He said, well, he says, today's kind of busy. Check in with me at the end of the week. And I called again the end of the week. He said, well, today's not so good either, you know. And I thought, okay, I'm never getting over there. I'm never going to be there. So I sort of gave up on that idea. And then George turned up in town. He had come in from California for a brief visit. And he sticks his head in my cutting room and he says, I'm going over to Kubrick's cutting room. You want to come along? And I said, yeah, you know, absolutely. Meanwhile, I had developed a kind of a cold. And Kubrick was a renowned germaphobe. So I'm trying not to sniffle too much, you know. But I thought I'm not gonna skip this just because of that. So we went over to where they were cutting, and we observed what he was doing. And he had all the dailies transferred to Betamax tapes, and he had an addressable Betamax machine, meaning that he could put in a footage, and the machine would wind down to that footage. And he had assistant editors prepare logs of every line of dialogue spoken on each videotape. And then he had cross-referenced so that he could see where every single reading of every single line of dialogue was. And he could, using the videotape, compare readings by winding down to the footage in these big logs. And then he would go and review the takes, and once he'd made his choice, he would tell the assistant editor, he'd go over to the shelf, get the film, he'd take it over to Ray, who was sitting at the chem, he would cut it in while Stanley was choosing the next piece of business. So that's how they worked. And Stanley looked at me very suspiciously the whole time.
It probably wasn't you. It's probably just him.
Yeah, it was me.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the story structure, because Empire, which is widely regarded as the best of the franchise, and you can debate that if you want, but a remarkably different kind of story structure from Star Wars, where Star Wars is a straight-ahead kind of rollicking good time.
Yes.
You know, Empire, obviously much darker in tone, but the thing that I didn't really think about until looking at it again a few days ago, the fact that the main characters aren't really together at all through the entire picture. And I could be wrong, you know, some of the hardcore fans will correct me, but I think there's only one scene in the whole film where Han, Luke, Leia, Chewie, and the droids are together, and that's when Luke is recovering after the Wampa attack on Hoth.
Right.
Your main characters are split up through basically the entire film.
Yeah. Yeah. Luke goes off to Dagobah.
Right. And so how different was that for you in that you had two storylines to cut, really?
Well, intercutting is the editor's friend. It solves the world of problems. But the script is very, every once in a while you work on a picture where the script is really right and it works. And this is pretty much the case. We went 3 months over in the shooting. We were scheduled for 16 weeks and they shot 29. But we were able to lock the picture 1 month after the end of principal photography because basically it worked as planned. There had been some reshuffling of scenes in the first 3 reels early on, but that was about it. Everything else sort of fell into place pretty well.
What wasn't working about those first 3 reels?
I don't remember. It was something about the probe droid and Luke with the Wampas. There was a whole idea in the script that got abandoned, which was the underground headquarters of the Alliance had been infiltrated by Wampas in the walls, and every once in a while, the camera would drift over, and you'd see a pair of eyes through the ice. And I think they just decided to get rid of that, and then that affected the continuity. The moment when Luke gets lost in the snowstorm and Han goes out and finds him, there had been a series of shots of Han trying to lift Luke in the snowstorm and struggling to drag him over to the Tauntaun. And I had sort of made a meal out of this. And Kirshner looked at it and he lifted this bony finger of his and he said, "Physical difficulty is boring." I thought, you know what? You're right, And so we just made a time cut. He was just there, so.
From what I remember from your book, which is a fantastic book. I'll remind everyone to go check it out a long time ago in a cutting room far, far away. There's so many things in the original Star Wars movies in 4, 5, and 6 that have been modified and updated over the years by George Lucas. And one of those things was that Wampa, Luke being taken prisoner by the Wampa.
Yeah.
And in the 1980 cut, it's almost like Jaws. You barely see the creature. I think there's one quick flash of his face, and you get a presence of him coming to get Luke.
Yeah.
But in the newer editions, there's a full on. You get to see him, and you see him eating some kind of creature, and there's a lot more going on there.
Yeah, a lot of blood.
Yeah, a lot of blood. When you were cutting it, were you struggling with that? Were you trying to incorporate the creature more, and it just wasn't working? How did you arrive at the cut that you did back in 1980?
Well, it wasn't my struggles. It was the production struggles. They couldn't get anything that looked any good. So, they had a guy in a suit, but it just looked ridiculous. So we couldn't use that. And in principal photography, all they could come up with was the claw. And it was only later in post that Phil Tippett and some other people came up with a little model of the Wampa's head. It looks huge on film, but it was, 4 inches high or whatever. And they did a take of it popping into frame, and it was just an inability on the production to make anything that looked any good. When the technology caught up with what George had hoped for, that they were able to deliver some shots that showed the creature.
When you're cutting stuff like that and you're thinking to yourself, well, this doesn't look good. But you also know that somebody else's job is to make it look good. Do you just sort of leave that for the director to say, oh, that's no good, we can't go with that? Or do you sort of stand up and say, you know what, I'm cutting this, I'm watching this footage every day, and we just can't go with this?
Yeah. I mean, if I think something's not good, I'm not going to put it in the picture. And if I think we need something and we don't have anything for it, I'll go and talk to the director and say, hey, that moment you think we don't have it because it looks like hell, doesn't work. That's the job. It's my job to make everybody look good. If the makeup is wrong, if the hair is wrong, if the extra is staring into the camera, if there's a costume malfunction or whatever, I'm supposed to eliminate all that. So you don't just put it in and say, oh, well, yeah, that was bad. I used to hear people talk about editing, oh, you just cut out the bad bits, and as if that were a joke. But in fact, when you think about it sort of reductively, that is what you're doing. But of course, The nuance is, well, what are the bad bits? So in deciding which are the bad bits and how to combine what's left, that's the art of it. I used to say you should cut every scene as simply as possible, but no simpler. Deciding which is the simplest version of the scene that's not too simple is the art.
Going back to those first 3 reels not coming together right. So, Lucas comes, you've been working hard on that with Kirsch.
Yeah.
Lucas comes over for the first time to see it and doesn't like what he sees. And he literally takes the cut into his own hands and reworks those scenes.
Yeah.
What is that like for you as the editor when the director comes in and says, just get out of the way, I'm going to sit down at the camera or the Moviola, or if it's modern times, the Avid. What's going through your head? What does that feel like?
Well, as a young man, I was a little wounded by that, but it was certainly his right. And when he showed us what he had done, I was a little bit horrified because some of the transitions that he made were kind of brutal. And Kirsch was beside himself because George had flopped some of the shots, because in his mind he had worked out how the sequence would go together, and George had thrown that out and come up with a new way of combining the shots. So in order to make it work, he'd flop some shots. That means changing, from right to left, reversing right and left like a mirror image. When you do that on film and project it, the focus is so critical on these projectors, is that if the projector is focused on the emulsion side of the film, then with a flop shot, the emulsion is on the other side. And we're talking about, fraction of a millimeter, the thickness of a piece of film, but that makes a difference. So that every time a shot that's flopped comes up, it comes up out of focus. So Kirsch and I are watching this in a screening, and he's moaning. Oh my God. He says, he made it look like I didn't know what I was doing, So we were both a little bit wounded by it. But then when I sat down and looked at it, and I thought, well, if I added 8 frames to this, it would make a much smoother cut. It wouldn't be so jarring, And then I sort of looked through each of the changes, and maybe I could tighten this up a little, and maybe I could extend this shot, or maybe, So I went to George and I went down my list. And he said, yeah, fine, do it all. It's fine. When he did it, he wasn't doing it like an editor would. He was, it was broad strokes, and he left it to me to sand the rough edges.
Between your skills as an editor and the fact that the production was sort of lagging behind, I'm assuming you had a pretty easy time of keeping up to camera, that you were not really behind production at all at any point.
Yeah, I usually finish work by 2 p.m. So I'd wander over to the set.
An idle editor can find ways of not getting into trouble, but finding ways of making contributions. I wonder, with all that time on your hands, what sort of things did you pick up from being on set? And did you see anything on set and go, okay, this is going to make it easier for me to cut, just knowing how this was shot? Or did you also just sort of lend a pair of eyes and say, I'm seeing some problems here, maybe you should try this a little differently?
Well, in particular, there was one scene where Vader appears in Cloud City, and these double doors slide open, and Han sees him. He reaches for his blaster, and Vader snatches the blaster out of his hand and flies through the air, and Vader catches it. And for the shot of Han, they had a monofilament attached to the tip of his blaster. And as he lifted it, they yanked it out of frame, out of his hand. You couldn't see the monofilament on film, and it was near the edge of frame anyway. And then they had a shot of the gun flying through the air, and then Kelvin Pike, who was the operator, did a quick pan of the thing flying through the air. I think it was just 8 frames or something of this thing. And then they were doing a shot of David Prowse as Vader catching the gun. So what they had figured out was they would do the monofilament trick, start with the gun in his hand, and then yank it out and run the film backwards so it looked like it was flying in. But then they had to figure out what his arm movement should be. They wanted to continue the shot so that he would bring his arm down after he caught it. So they were trying to figure out what a natural movement backward would look like as he lifted his arm in order to shoot it. And they had these long discussions. And I said, I happened to be there, and I said, why don't you just toss it to him? They said, huh? I said, just toss him the gun. Just aim for his hand, So Prowse said, yeah, let me try it. So He fumbled the first one. He did a second take, and he caught it, and that was it. I remember also visiting the set one time early on, and this was a scene in Hoth, and they had involved some shooting, and they had explosive charges set in the wall, and they had steam going. It was always very complicated to match the level of steam. If it was too much or too little, they had to get it right so that it would match from cut to cut. And there were, crews dedicated just to the steam and everything else. And so they get the camera set, and as a courtesy, they say, "Okay, Kirsch, would you just look through the camera, see if this is okay for you?" And Kirsch came over and he looks through the eyepiece and he says, "No, not right. Camera should be here." And he indicates a foot to the right. So they dutifully move foot over to the right. They have to relay the track because it was going to track in or something. And the operator comes up and he looks through. He says, "Well, Kirsch, with the camera here, now we're starting to see up the top left of the frame. If you look, you're starting to see off the set." So Kirsch goes, "Okay, can we put something up there?" So then we get carpenters and grips, and another hour goes by while they're fixing something. So that was sort of why we went 13 weeks over, rather than saying, "All right, put it back where it was and let's shoot." He would say, "Oh, let's fix that problem that I've just created."
Something else that you were able to do in your idle time, cutting the trailer.
Yeah. Gary Kurtz came to me. He says, "We're going to need a trailer, And I said, "This is about a month into shooting. We had hardly any film." He says, "We're going to need a trailer." I said, "Trailer with what? I don't have anything." He says, "Well, you don't need it just yet, but keep it in mind." So I had started out editing trailers. So I had some background in this. So about maybe a month later, I started thinking, they're going to ask me for that trailer pretty soon. Let me see what I've got, So I was looking through the footage, and I wrote a script, what I thought was sort of a deliberately cheesy trailer. The idea was that Star Wars was based on movie serials from the 30s. That would have been the inspiration, Buck Rogers and those kind of things. And I tried to do the trailer in the style of trailers of that era. So it went something along the lines of Luke Skywalker and Han Solo rescued the Princess Leia from Darth Vader, but the story didn't end there. And then wrote some other stuff. And I put it together with, I'd written this script, and I needed a narration to use for cutting. And I thought, well, who can I ask? And at that time, Mark Hamill's wife was expecting a baby any minute. And Mark was walking around the set with a cardboard sign hanging from his neck saying, "Don't ask." Because I guess everyone was coming up to him and saying, "Has the baby come yet? Has the baby come yet?" So he had this sign around his neck saying, "Don't ask." So I thought, I should just probably leave Mark alone. So I thought, well, who else can I ask? And there was Harrison. So I went to Harrison. I said, "Harrison, I'm doing this trailer and I need a narration." He said, "So you want an American actor, I guess?" I said, yeah, I would. He says, "And pickings are kind of slim, I guess." I said, "Yeah, there's not, So he said, "All right, I'll do it, So I said, "Come on, it'll take half an hour, do it. We'll go to the stage after the end of the day one day, half an hour it would be done." And so he did it. So he's great. He did a couple of takes. I said, "Play it like a newsboy announcing an extra edition." So he did, and I cut the trailer. I laid in music from the first film, threw in a few sound effects, mixed it, sent it off to California. I got a phone call from one of George's assistants. He says, "George loves the trailer." I said, "Oh, great. That's great." He says, "And we love the announcer. Who is that? We want to use him for the final." And I said, "That's Harrison." He says, "Harrison?" I said, "Harrison Ford. He's one of the stars of our movie." And they hadn't recognized him because he played it so differently from the way, he was overplaying instead of underplaying, which is how Han was better acted than the newsboy. So anyway, I went and found Harrison. I said, "Harrison, we're a hit." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, George heard the trailer. He loves the trailer. And he wants to use you for the final for the final mix." So he said, "Well, wait a second. Hang on." They pay big money for this kind of stuff. I know, because my father used to do voiceovers. He said, how much are you getting for the trailer? I said, me? I'm not getting anything. He says, what? I said, no, I just get my salary for cutting the movie. And he says, oh, that's not right. He says, I'm going to ask for 10 grand. I'm going to give you half.
Nice.
So at that point, Gary Kurtz comes by and he says, Harrison, can I talk to you for a second? He says, sure, Gary. And he puts his arm around his shoulder and he goes off and he gives me a wink. So they go off and they talk and he comes back. He says, I only had the nerve to ask for 5 grand. So about a week later, I got a check for $2,500 from Harrison.
Wow.
Which is, a lot of money for me then.
And you got to direct Harrison Ford.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. There was a long discussion about Harrison trying to renegotiate a contract for the third film. During post, we were aware that discussions were ongoing with Harrison. He was resisting being in the third film, and George threatened to carry around that prop of him frozen in the carbonite for the whole of the third film and then blowing it up in the last reel. So in the meantime, Harrison had done 2 pictures and both were flops. So he re-signed with George. And I think he had shot Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark by then. But anyway, I saw Harrison at the cast and crew screening of Empire Strikes Back. So I said to him, I understand you're coming back for the third film. He says, yeah, you think I have any career without these guys? So
yeah, he did all right by them.
He did all right, and they did all right by him. And then at George's 50th birthday party, years later, I was at the ranch, and I saw Harrison. And I went up to him, and I said, I want to thank you again for that trailer money, He had forgotten all about it. He didn't remember it. I don't know if he remembered it even when I reminded him. I said to him, I'm really thrilled with the way your career has turned out. And he looked at me, he said, imagine how I feel.
So since you brought up Jedi, well, before we get to Jedi, one of the big things about Empire was the big reveal about Vader being Luke's father.
Right.
And what's remarkable, if that were done today, there's no way that wouldn't have leaked out. Just somehow that would have gotten out and it would have been spoiled. And I don't remember any sort of leaks or advanced knowledge about the big Vader being Luke's father. So I'm curious about what you knew about it, because I know that a lot of people were kept in the dark during production, and I'm assuming in post-production as well, up until maybe at least ADR.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And, frankly, I don't really remember. I think, obviously at some point I found out and I went, oh my God, But I thought, what did it say in the script? And I went back and I looked at my script, and there's a page missing in that scene.
How did you cut it without the page?
Well, I didn't always look at the script when I was cutting a scene, I'd look at the dailies, always referring to the script. So what I remember about them shooting that scene is they had these wind machines going, and they made an incredible noise. And in fact, they were so loud that the sound recorders couldn't even take a guide track. Mark had to loop the scene with no guide track. I always felt the sync was a little dicey, but that's what I think about when I see the scene. I remember the production difficulties.
Okay, so Return of the Jedi. I asked you about having a notion of a sequel while you were doing Star Wars. When you were working on Empire, how much of an awareness was there about Jedi and how the storyline would continue into Jedi? When did George come up with the idea that Vader was Luke's father or that Leia was Luke's sister? And how did those sort of roll out over time during the making of these films?
Well, as you know, I did not work on the third film, and there was not much discussion about the third film while we were working on the second because we were busy working on the second. I know that in my discussions with George, sort of general discussions, he had worked out the story for all 9 films, and he had it in a vault somewhere. He had, he had his story in locked in a safe somewhere. But, it was all conjecture during the first film because who knew if the picture would succeed or not. George thought it would make about the same amount of money as Walt Disney films. He said, this is basically a Disney movie. That's why he cast Leia for 9-year-olds instead of teenage boys. He had in mind, the Disney model at that time was they would roll out their animated films every 7 years. They would re-release Snow White and, Cinderella and Fantasia every 7 years. So they would get a new crop of kids. 7 years later, the little kids would have grown. There'd be a new batch of little kids. So this is what I had in mind for Star Wars, that it would never be on TV. It would never be on video. The only way you could ever see it was in a theater, and it would come out every 7 years. That was his plan. And, of course, I remember on Empire, some of the video stores in Marin started to advertise that you could rent Star Wars. And I don't know where they got the cassettes from. They were on cassettes then. And I said to them, what happens if you don't return the cassette? They said, you have to pay a fine, So I did that. I rented one and I paid the fine. And, I essentially bought this cassette. And it was terrible. It was just terrible quality. You could see on all the visual effects shots, you could see the garbage mats.
Right.
Where it was just horrible looking. So, but George had never had any intention of it going on TV. I mean, because he thought it was going to make the same as the Disney movie. And he says they all make $16 million. And then that's what I expect to make on this.
So I know you don't always hew too closely to the script, but when Yoda says to Obi-Wan that there is another, in response to Obi-Wan saying Luke is our last hope, did you have any inkling of what Yoda was talking about?
No, I said to George, who is the other? He said, you'll have to wait.
He did it to you too.
Yeah.
I brought up, and you'd also brought up ADR, and it seems like there's a lot of looping, like a lot of overdubs happen. I mean, certainly with David Prowse, much to his dismay.
Yeah.
But it seems like in Empire and Star Wars, there's a lot of looping that was going on. And were you heavily involved in that as well?
I was involved in the cutting of it. I was supervising the cutting of it because there had been a mishap on the first film where the moment that our group arrives in Mos Eisley, they're stopped by some stormtroopers, and Ben does this Jedi mind trick. And the troopers' responses had been laid in about 8 frames late. So when I saw it, I thought, oh my God, that's not right. And I hadn't been able to go to the mix because my daughter was a newborn at the time, and they were mixing all night and I couldn't be there. So anyway, this had sort of slipped through the cracks, and it was later corrected, I think, in the later versions. It's funny, when I watch Star Wars movies now, I don't remember anymore. Is this the way it was originally, or is this something new? It's over 40 years later, and I haven't seen the films, and I think, did we do it that way, or did we not do it? I don't remember, On Empire, I wanted to make sure that that sort of accident didn't happen again, and I reviewed all the ADR tracks that were cut by other editors just to make sure they were okay.
Well, earlier you talked about adding a few shots at the end of Star Wars at George's request to open the possibility of there being a sequel. For Empire, I think he took it a step further, that even after the film was out, you had to go back and add some shots. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay. Well, I will so this is what I've heard, in that the initial release of the film, and it was not wide release, but just I think in a few theaters, it was unclear the ending of where the alliance was, that they had regrouped. So they had to go back and add some shots of the fleet at the very end of Empire that weren't there in the very first release of the film.
I don't remember.
Well, it's only been 40 years.
Yeah. And a lot of dailies. I was going to tell you about a mistake that Kirsch made that had to be corrected. And I don't think anybody knows this story. You're the first, Matt.
Okay.
When Luke is rescued from the bottom of the mast that he's hanging from, the Falcon comes up under him. Is it Leia's flying the ship at that point, and I think Lando goes up and...
Yeah, I think Chewie or Leia. Chewie's flying the ship, and Leia and Lando go attend to Luke, but it is Lando, I think, that pulls him into the ship.
All right, so there's a shot looking up through the hatch of Lando helping Luke down through the hatch into the ship. And when Kirsch shot it, he shot it during the day exterior. So there was bright sky behind them. So this didn't match. It was supposed to be dusk. So what they had to do when ILM did the exterior of the Falcon coming up under Luke and the hatch opening up, they put in a bright light inside the ship, shining up out, as if there were an airlock with bright light in it. So they go down into this brightly lit airlock, and then that justified the bright light behind Lando and Luke when they're lowered into the ship.
Do you have a favorite line or scene from Empire?
Well, like I say, I thought that scene of lifting the ship out of the bog struck me. But I think that, part of it is that is the philosophical core of all the Star Wars movies is sort of really enunciated at that moment. And the score is magnificent. And the puppetry is fantastic. And, and then there's a lot of stuff in Cloud City that I think is really stellar, really the stuff that Kirsch did with 3PO in pieces and the Wookiee trying to put them together again. There's a lot of, Kirsch had a great sense of humor. And I think a lot of that comes through in a lot of the scenes, obviously with Leia and Han at the beginning is sort of like a rom-com. And then later on with Chewie and 3PO as they're making their escape from the place. So I thought the Cloud City stuff is, obviously they've worked on a lot of those shots. They got rid of all the matte lines. It was very difficult when the picture was first released. The matte lines showed in almost all the shots of the city against the clouds and the ships against the clouds. And it's very difficult for them to disguise the matte lines in their in that technology of that day. But now that's all been fixed.
So you really can fix everything in post.
I guess, if you have enough money.
Well, apparently George Lucas does. I've heard you say that of all your films, Carrie is one that you wouldn't change anything about. I think I'm recalling correctly that it was Carrie that you thought, no, I wouldn't change anything about that.
Yeah.
But I've also heard you say, you don't really look at your films, as we talked about earlier. Once they're out, you don't think about making any changes. But because of that contradiction, I'm just going to ask, now that you've seen Empire again,
yeah,
if there's anything that you could change editorially, what would you change?
I don't know. It looked good to me.
Yeah, I'd say it looked pretty good to a whole lot of people. Well, I hope you enjoyed this unique bit of insight into the making of one of the biggest movies of all time, direct from the man behind the editing bench. I especially hope you enjoyed all the parts that detail just how much editors are involved in the crafting of a story, beyond just putting a bunch of clips together in a timeline. I would like to offer my most heartfelt gratitude to Paul for once again talking with us about his career, this time in depth on one particular film, and what a film it is. And I also want to thank you, all of you, whether you were on this train from the beginning or you recently discovered the podcast. You are what really keeps it going, and your feedback and words of encouragement are appreciated more than you know. It has been a lot of fun bringing you this podcast for the past year, and I look forward to seeing what the next year holds. No matter what shows or movies we're watching or where we're watching them, I can promise you we'll be getting to know the people that made them on this little podcast. So until we meet again on your favorite podcasting app, this is your pal Matt Fury thanking you once again for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.